American system differs, where you have this constitutional separation of church and state, how a secular education system operates in comparison to the Irish system, how this impacts in practical terms. So,
okay, so I haven't prepared for this, I'm warning you, so these are going to be informal remarks. What I want to do is say a bit about the American system from the perspective of somebody like me, who is a scientist, a science educator, and also a very noisy atheist, and how it all fits together. What I will say, though, is primarily that what we've got in the American educational system is a great many problems, that we have some severe weaknesses, and from what I hear from Paul Rowe about Educate Together, you ought to follow his vision and not the American plan if you want to build a great school system that will surpass us. That we have some very serious problems. We do have some strengths, and one was already mentioned. We have an entirely secular school system. So we have a constitutional separation of church and state, which means that there is no religious instruction in our public schools at all. And in fact, if anybody tries to introduce any kinds of religious instruction, it's grounds for a lawsuit, and people are pretty quick about doing that. And it can shut down entire schools and cost them a great deal of money. This is particularly apparent when you look at some of the controversial issues we're dealing with now. My particular focus is on evolution. And evolution is a hot-button issue in the United States. And we have had many efforts by people to introduce religious concepts about the origin of the world into our curriculum. And they failed. These have gone all the way to the Supreme Court. There have been numerous court cases, and in just about every case, except some of the earliest ones, they've been soundly defeated. So we don't have that happening right now. Although they are trying harder and harder to get it introduced. Yes?
Just a point of clarification. When you say they've tried to introduce religious ideas, do you mean they've tried to introduce them overtly as religious ideas or covertly as they were scientific?
Both. In 1987, for instance, we had a Supreme Court case, Edwards versus Aguilar, in which the creationists argued that they wished to introduce creationism, religious-based creationism, as a legitimate alternative to the scientific theory. So that was a blatant attempt, and that was defeated. A few years back, we also had the Dover trial, and that was 1993, 95, somewhere in there, where they tried to be sneaky about it and use the cloak of intelligent design and say, well, this is a scientific theory. And again, they were defeated. It was very transparent. We'll see right through to the fact that this was a religious effort. So that's the good news. We are keeping that out. And I think that's good for the students. We are also a nation that's rather more diverse than Ireland. And so that's a necessary thing. So it's also a good part of our background. But let me say a few things about the weaknesses of the American school system, things you do not want to emulate under any circumstances. One of the major weaknesses is funding. The American public school system is very clumsily funded. It's all funded at the local level. There's usually disbursement of funds from the state, a small number of funds from the state on the basis of number of students. But where we really rely on raising money for local schools is local levies, particularly property taxes. So it all depends on the voters in the district being willing to vote in extra taxes for themselves in order to pay for the schools. And you can guess how often that fails. So as costs go up, schools are financially strapped, and we get into these nice cycles where year after year we try to introduce levies that will increase taxes by some small amount just to fund them. And they go down in defeat over and over and again until we're in a crisis state, and then maybe we're lucky and get them to pass. It's not a good way to operate. It's also a bad way to operate because of the disparities. This means that if you are in a rich neighborhood where there's plenty of money floating around, your schools will be well funded. If you are in a poor enough neighborhood where it doesn't matter how much you raise the taxes, you're not going to get much money out of them, your schools are in a desperate state. So the schools that need it the worst, or the most, are the ones that get it the least, and those that are already well funded are prospering. So again, we've got this problem in the United States. We're a very diverse nation, but we've also got an extremely wide divide between the rich and the poor. And the educational system is promoting that as well. So don't make that mistake. Get good funding. Get a stable funding source. The other thing is standards. What are you going to teach in the schools? I go through the website of Educate Together, and I see they've got a grand coherent plan, which is another essential for doing good education. We don't have that in the United States. There is no national curriculum. Yes?
Just to bring you up to date, we already have that system in Ireland, and that diversity of outcome, because we call them fee-paying schools, and we have a number in the private sector. And even within, as Paul has mentioned, the vocational system, there is a diversity that you couldn't get if you actually design, well, obviously, maybe they have designed it to provide that. So we already have the worst of your system within ours.
I'm sorry. It ought to be a priority to try and fix that. It ought to be a priority in the United States that we try to fix this as well. But we just keep on coasting along. Okay, so standards. What are you going to teach in the schools? We have no national standards. Nothing at all. All standards are set at the state level. The way this is done is that every couple of years, again, it depends from state to state exactly when you do it. The state will appoint a board. They'll bring in experts, community members, teachers, scientists, historians, people involved in these particular academic fields. And they'll bring them in for committee meetings where they will sit down and write a fairly lengthy document that specifies for each grade level what will be taught in each subject. Usually this amounts to, maybe 5 or 6 lines, or we may say, for instance, that in the 10th grade you're supposed to learn basic biology, and they will list 5 or 6 things that ought to be on the curriculum. These are binding by law, that schools are expected to meet these standards once they're established. And that, for instance, in 10th grade, in the curriculum, the teacher is expected to include all of those subjects at some point in that term. It doesn't matter, there's no instruction how to teach this stuff. So this is not establishing pedagogy, but it's basically just working to get a common foundation for everybody to experience as they go through the system. Now, as I said, it's not a national system, it's state by state. So that's not good. There's a lot of variation. We actually have some bodies in the United States that evaluate state standards and then actually give grades to them. And of course there are states that get Fs in the science standards and others that get As. So huge amount of variation on that basis. The other problem with this is that it has become highly politicized. That if you have this body going out there in each state every couple of years, deciding what the students will learn, this is a target for political action. That if you want something in the schools, like creationism or religion in some stealth form, the way you can do it is work on getting onto these committees and getting it into the draft standards. That what you will often do is, and what we often see, is people will try to smuggle in very vague sorts of statements in science standards. For instance, in my field again, in the 10th grade standards, they may say, teachers should teach the strengths and weaknesses of evolutionary explanations. Which sounds good in a sense. We do in science want to teach both strengths and weaknesses. But on the other hand, it's really a code phrase that they use to allow teachers to talk about creationism as an alternative theory. So we have to watch these things like hawks to make sure that these don't sneak in. We also see a lot of effort done in the political, in the historical arena. It's not just science that's afflicted by this. There's a lot of revisionist history that tries to get smuggled into the state standards. So it gets kind of ugly. There's not a lot we can do about that with this particular system in place. Now, we don't have universal standards that we can say, and also that they are not set by an independent body of qualified experts. I would love to see, for instance, the AAAS or the National Academy of Sciences, the big scientific bodies.